presentations, and then again, we'd like to keep this as interactive as possible, which I neglected to say when we started out. I'd like to now present and turn over the floor to Glen Peters, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for International Climate Research in Oslo, who will now put what Kevin Anderson presented into a more Swedish context and take in actually our consumption patterns and our galloping carbon footprints here.
Okay, thank you. You all hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep. Hopefully this will be okay. So I think I drew the short straw to follow Kevin in the presentation, so hopefully I can keep this relatively interesting and have a little bit of a positive spin at the end. And I guess you'll notice Kevin at the end had a little bit of a positive spin, so he fell victim to all other academics and climate scientists who always seem to put a positive spin at the end. So galloping carbon footprints. So I'm going to talk about carbon footprints at a global scale, but also zoom into the Swedish level, and the sort of subtitle here, Swedish consumption's indisputable contribution to steadily increasing emissions. Being a climate scientist, saying things like indisputable is not usually in my language. I'm usually much more cautious than that, and I'll talk a bit about uncertainty when I talk about Sweden's estimates. So Kevin had a very similar figure to this. This is global emissions from fossil fuel consumption, cement production and gas flaring from 1990 onwards. And we sort of copied each other here, showing that climate policy is causing emissions to increase, if anything else. So emissions have grown from about 1% per year increase in the 90s to about 3% plus per year in the 2000s. What's interesting is what's driving this increase. Of course, China is a very influential component in the 2000s, which we'll touch on later. But taking the sort of Kyoto view of emissions, we have this sort of NX1, or non-NX1 split, the NXB split if you use the Kyoto Protocol language, or developed countries and developing countries. So this figure here just splits the emissions on the previous slide into those coming from developed countries, the black line, and those coming from developing countries, the red line. Now this sort of split is used a lot in negotiations, and I think it's very problematic in negotiations. That's starting to get broken now, and I think it's set back climate negotiations by many years by having the world split into two countries. We're unfortunately not that homogeneous. And you'll see in the developed countries, the emissions are relatively stable over time. There's several factors causing this to be more or less a straight line. At individual countries, you have a lot of emissions growth in some countries, and you have also had the collapse of the former Soviet Union, which is the real reason that this line is flat. We have a little bit of help from the financial crisis in 2009, and I don't think there's much climate policy in that black line. Of course, there's going to be a little bit in individual countries, but there's many other factors there. The red line is the interesting one. This is the developing countries. Emissions are growing rapidly. China is the main driver, particularly from 2000. India is also having a big influence, and so on. One problem with this split between NX1 and non-NX1 countries is we're talking about a global pollutant. And Kevin mentioned this a few times. It doesn't really matter where the emissions occur, the impacts are the same. And so, from an analysis point of view, it doesn't make too much sense to split these two lines. And so you have to ask the question, how are they connected? We know the world's got connected through international trade and international financial transfers and so on. So are these black and red lines connected? And if we look at the international trade dimension, this is a figure from some colleagues in Stanford University. A nice figure, gets a lot of coverage. I'm not sure how many people have seen this figure. But it shows, for 2004, around about 23% of global emissions are from the production of traded products. And there's a very distinctive pattern. So this sort of big black arrow here, the 395 megatons CO2, these are the emissions that occur in China to produce products which are then exported and then consumed in the US. So the emissions occur in China, the products are consumed in the US. And of course you have a big flow going from China into the EU, China into Japan. China's very influential here. US into the EU, Russia into the EU, the EU out to the US and so on. And of course you can go into all the sort of details here, I won't spend much time on it. But overall, a pretty robust conclusion in most studies is that rich countries, NXB, OECD, however you want to define developed countries, are net importers of emissions. So their products are being consumed in developing countries, which are then exported and consumed in the developed countries. One thing that's a little bit interesting, it might be a little bit hard to see here, this shows various variables, macro variables at the global level and how they've changed over time. It's indexed to 100 in 1990. We have population, GDP, global emissions all down the bottom here, around about 50% growth since 1990. But the really big factor here growing is international trade. International trade is growing much faster than economic activity. And therefore you would expect that these lines here, these arrows, are getting fatter over time. So it's not necessarily a problem that we trade and there's flows of emissions between countries, there's good reasons for trade. But if they're changing in a way that undermines our climate policy, then we have an issue. So going back to the Kyoto view of emissions, again, this is the same figure as before, slightly different scale, but we have the developed country emissions as more or less the straight line, and the developing countries as the increasing line. Now we can go through a bit of analysis, and for each country we can take out the emissions to produce exports, add in the emissions to produce imports, so we go from a territorial perspective, as we have here, to a consumption perspective, and we end up with something like this. And you'll see for the developed countries, the horizontal line, their emissions become higher, which means the developed countries are net importers of emissions. And quite symmetric to that, you have the developing countries with the strong growth, their emissions become lower because they are net exporters of emissions. This sort of gap between the lines is growing over time, and in 2008, this is the paper we published last year, if you compare the red bit on the left with the red bit on the right, how has this grown over time? And this sort of emission transfer between countries has grown about 5 times greater than the emission reduction achieved in the Kyoto Protocol. This is measured relative to 2008 because of the financial crisis. It'll be a little bit different, maybe it's 2-3 times different. I haven't looked at the actual number, although it's not that hard to do. But the main point here is that climate policy or international trade is unintentionally undermining climate policy. And I say unintentionally here, I don't think countries are deliberately trying to do this. It's just the consequence of the way the world's developing. China's growing, other countries are growing, and one way that they grow is through their exports. And we happen to like consuming their exports. So this is in a sense, the global picture or the NXB, non-NXB picture. And within that, there's a lot of countries, and you can go into a lot of country details, and I'm going to pick on Sweden today for many reasons. And the Swedish results have a few unusual features, and there's been some debate, as Ricard mentioned right at the start. I just Googled my name and Sweden in Google News and looked at the stories that came up, and these were some of the stories that came up on the first page or two, talking about this issue of has Swedish consumption-based emissions also gone down in addition to their territorial emissions. So that's what I'm going to talk about for the next 5 or 10 minutes. But first, a slight little detour and have a look at Swedish emissions from 1900. These are carbon dioxide emissions from a US data set. It's a little bit related to what Kevin was talking about, and it's looking back in the historic record at what happens. This is something we've been doing for another paper. These grey vertical lines are sort of global or events with global repercussions, particularly on emissions. So there's the World Wars there's the Great Depression, the 2 oil shocks over here. And in particular, the Swedish emissions grew quite rapidly from the 50s through to the 70s. Didn't calculate the emissions growth, but it's probably 5% per year, quite rapid. And then there's this rapid decline in 5% per year. And this is the shift, the reduction in oil and the increase in nuclear. And whether you like nuclear or not in terms of climate, this is good. This is a more than 10 years, this is a 12-year period where emissions have gone down at almost 5% per year. And just forget about the nuclear for a minute and just think of this as a technology. So a technology came along Sweden grabbed that technology, not for climate reasons, but for other reasons, and emissions reduced at 5% per year. If other countries can do similar things with new technologies that come along and we can repeat it, this is something that Kevin was saying, then we're well on our way to 2 degrees. And so we have to keep, I think, this sort of positive belief that we can actually reduce emissions whilst the economy grows. And of course you can reduce the emissions even more if the economy is not growing. Since the 1986 sort of period onwards, emissions have gone down about 1% per year, so it's a decline. This isn't a bad thing. We can't complain about this. It's better than emissions going up 1% per year. Maybe we would like it to go down 10% per year, but we can't complain too much by the fact that the emissions have gone down. It could be worse. Although what I'm going to focus on is this sort of period from 1990 onwards, and as in the sort of title of the presentation and the work on the global level, is this, this decrease in emissions offset by an increase in emissions from importing more products. Now, something I said at the start about this indisputable sort of word is the next few slides I'm going to show a lot of uncertainties. And the reason I want to do this is so you can understand why the results are the way they are. So these abstract labels here that you can't understand, I'll explain them in a minute, are 5 independent studies, actually 4 independent studies, estimating the Swedish carbon footprint for CO2 emissions. So, and these are the territorial emissions, the production-based emissions, which go as input into these models. So you can imagine when I show you the next slide, which has got consumption, you're going to see some variation. And one of the reasons you're going to see variations between the estimates is the input data has variations. So this is one of the key messages. These 2 studies down the bottom, which you can't see, this top line here, these are 2 studies which I've done. And I've just recently updated these, but I haven't got them on the slides. This is coming from Statistics Sweden. It's the sort of green line you see at the end there. This is based on it's IEA energy data using the OECD economic data. And this is an Australian outfit. It's a very big database project, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the slide, next slide. So there's already some variation in the territorial emissions which go as input, and we can explain many of these variations. We know different people use different emission factors, there's different assumptions on what's included, what's not included, and so on. So we need to be aware that different studies will have different estimates. So if I take these territorial estimates, we take out the emissions to produce exports, add in the emissions to produce imports and convert it to consumption, we end up with this figure here. And of course when you see this figure it looks like a bit of a scatter plot. So these are the consumption-based emissions in Sweden, the carbon footprint, if you like. And the first thing I'll point out is this purple study. I intentionally included it in here, even though the results look very different to the other estimates. My 2 studies are these ones just here down the bottom. Here's Statistics Sweden, and this other study in there. So you can see there's a lot of scatter, but there's a couple of different features that you will notice. There's this sort of decline in the first part of the period, which is relatively robust across studies, and this sort of increase towards the end. Next slide will make this much clearer. This Australian study at the top, it's a huge data project, and it's very automated. And when you have such a huge data project, it's very hard to go through and check all the data. And I know they've spotted some problems in some countries, the UK and another country I can't remember, and they probably haven't looked at Sweden, but this will raise an eyebrow if they looked at that database. Some of the other estimates show this increase. Why this Australian database is having such a big increase, I think it's just going to be a data quirk. What we can do is we can take the territorial estimates and look at the difference with the consumption-based estimates and get what we call the net emission transfers, or the exports minus, or the imports minus exports in terms of emissions. The studies come together now, the results are more similar. This is because we're subtracting out some of the differences in the studies. What is clear, these numbers are all positive. This means that Sweden is a net importer of emissions. This is a very robust result across all studies. I can go into other studies which show the same thing. And this isn't too surprising. As a global average, Sweden has quite low CO2 per GDP, and its importing partners have quite high CO2 per GDP. So you would expect Sweden to be a net importer, even if it had a trade surplus. The Swedish study, Statistics Sweden, is a bit lower. I think there's methodological reasons why you can explain that. But you'll see, again, there's this period where there's a decline in the first from the 90s and an increase in the 2000s. The next slide, I'll look at my results in particular and explain what's causing that difference. So this figure, it's a bit of a difficult figure to read. Perhaps it's the raw data. It shows the emissions occurring in other countries to produce products which are imported into Sweden. So these are the emissions in Germany, the emissions in the Russian Federation, and so on. And the top line there is the total emissions imported into Sweden, and again you get this U shape. And you'll see, I'll put the arrows on. Over here we have this country is causing the collapse, and over here this country is causing the increase. So the drop in the 1990s is caused by the collapse of the former Soviet Union. There's some data issues there, of course. Anyone that's tried to work with data around the 1990s, including the former Soviet Union, will happily have a beer with me and complain about data. But it's also quite clear there was a huge drop in emissions in the former Soviet and in economic activity, and it has a very high emission intensity, and so this isn't that surprising that you get this decrease in the 90s. Moving on, you'll see in the 2000s this increase is almost purely coming from China. This is a strong signal in just about every country's carbon footprint. The increase in recent years is driven by increased imports into increased exports from China. This sort of pattern of this collapse of the former Soviet and the increase in China is particularly strong in the Nordic countries. If you go to the UK, you don't have this this former Soviet effect. If you go to some other countries, you don't have this former Soviet effect. So when people do pick the 1990 value and then pick the 2008 value, they're in a sense kidding themselves, because they're completely different drivers which are causing these differences. And if you want to design policies, you have to understand what the drivers are. You can't just hope that there's going to be China's going to collapse next year. Interestingly, on the plane last night, I read an article in the Financial Times which more or less predicted China's going to collapse because it's spending too much on capital. And Japan collapsed after it had too much on capital. South Korea collapsed after it had spent too much on capital. And China's expenditure on capital is much higher than any other country. So we'll see, of course. It was an interesting thing to read on the plane over here. Just as a sort of exercise, you can take out former Soviet and China out of this figure and see what happens. And you see you no longer have this inverted U shape. So this is just emphasising the two different drivers in these emissions. The policy implications. So next 5 minutes or so, not sure how I'm going on time, I just want to talk about some policy implications, and these are quite broad brush. There's a lot of studies now looking at the numbers, how has the emissions from consumption changed, and so on. Very few studies looking at the policy implications. There's some projects coming up now which I'll sort of mention towards the end. One of the first things we say is that consumption-based approaches are complementary measures. So we're not saying throw out the system that you currently have, throw out the emissions trading system, it's no good, just have a consumption-based system. That's not going to work. Just as you have in a technology sort of debate, there is no silver bullet. It's the same in a policy context. You need to have lots of different policies focusing on different areas and have those policies be complementary. The first thing you need to do is to be able to know where you are. You need to be able to measure consumption-based emissions. At the moment, it's primarily researchers that are measuring consumption-based emissions. You are seeing some statistical offices starting to do their own estimates. They have extra constraints because they need a consistency with their national accounts. I won't go into the details there. But when you're measuring it, you know how you're going. If it's going in the wrong direction, you can design policy instruments and you can assess to see if they're working. You can't do anything unless you're measuring it. So this would be the first policy recommendation. Statistics Sweden has done some work here. I'm not sure if they still have this project ongoing or if they're updating the numbers. It goes to 2006 here. Statistics Netherlands, I know, has done some work. Statistics Denmark's done some work. There's work going on in the UK. These are all statistical offices. Canada, I believe, done some work. I think Australia has. So many countries are working on this, but as I sort of mentioned, they have some additional constraints, which if someone asks a question, I can get into later. One thing that we tend to forget, we always think about emission inventories as a number. Oh, our emissions are 50, and last year they were 51, or last year they were 49. But emission inventories have a lot of information in them. And particularly when you go to a consumption-based inventory, you include the economic system, you've got trade flows, you also have the territorial emissions in there. So there's a lot of information you can extract from that emission inventory to figure out different things. You can understand what's causing emissions to change. You can look at how you may green trade flows, and I sort of put a little question in there, coming back to China, because I guess we're going to talk bad things about China at some stage, but is it bad to import an electric car from China? Is that a problem? It might have more emissions than producing it in, let's say, Germany, but overall in its life cycle it might be better to import that electric car from China than to not import that electric car from China. And China, with its production capacity, can drive down prices. So another sort of spin on China is how can we use China to help mitigate, because it has the production capacity that other countries don't have. And importantly, trade is a link between production and consumption, so you can use these emission inventories to look at consumption patterns and production methods and so on. I won't go into details here. This is a study we did a few years ago, looking at the carbon footprint in different countries at the sectoral level, looking at how it changes with income across regions and so on. This is just an example of the sorts of things you can do. This is analysing a supply chain for the purchase of wearing apparel in Norway. You could do this, it will look exactly the same almost in Sweden. And when you go through this sort of supply chain, it's quite truncated here. You'll see these numbers here. These are where most of the emissions are occurring in the supply chain. It's not the clothing that's causing the emissions, it's electricity production in China. So when you go and buy some clothes next time, it's a power plant in China which is causing those emissions. And you can understand these things, the link between consumption and production, using these sorts of emission inventories. So there's many reasons to look at these emission inventories. This black blob is, if you like, Sweden's carbon dioxide emissions from a production perspective. And you think of it as the emission trading system in Sweden. And the exporters, the heavy industry, the metal exporters in particular, they complain that they're going to jump on a ship and go to China, and so we give them subsidies, we give them free permits, and we remove exports. And so the base of the climate policy starts to get smaller and smaller. We cover less emissions because we're giving subsidies to certain industries. You can compensate that by adding imports, and there's a lot of rhetoric about that, but we never actually do it. And when you combine these two, if you take a production system, you remove exports, add imports, you end up at a consumption system. So our current approach, we sort of remove exports, we don't add in the imports. So we're in a sense trying to deal with competitiveness concerns by going to consumption, but we don't go the full way there. The advantage of these consumption policies, in this sort of way I've explained it here, is they're competitiveness neutral. You can act unilaterally without having fear that your industries will leave. And so one important thing is that when you have subsidies for exporters, you have to add importers in somehow, otherwise you're just reducing your coverage of your system. We might touch on this border tax adjustment later. I don't want to go into it in too much detail. There's a lot of nuances in this debate. A lot of literature says if you want to keep the global trading system working efficiently, you can't avoid dealing with this border tax issue at some stage. eventually in the future, climate policy and trade policy will go on a collision course. And a lot of successful environmental agreements, the Montreal Protocol, integrate trade into that agreement. Something that most people don't think about, but a value-added tax system, mums, in Sweden is based on consumption. The tax doesn't go on exports, it goes on imports. And we don't complain about the WTO implications of that. There was some work that was done about 30 years ago which described why you can have a VAT system designed on consumption. And it means that you can have a tax system unilaterally. If you want to have a consumption tax and no one else does, then it works. If another country wants to have a consumption tax, they do it in the same way, take their exports out, add imports, and it works. I'll skip some of the other points there. Something that Kevin mentioned a few things. I've called them micro level policies here. If you like, demand side policies, behavioural change, examples, less meat or transport behaviour. Kevin gave some examples of transport behaviour combined with technology. Of course, Kevin didn't come, he did a virtual meeting. This is behavioural change. Many studies, there's always a lot of promise in it. It sounds good, but most studies find the real world effects are small. And there's many reasons for this, and this is where you bring in the social scientists to describe our cultural settings for our consumption and so on and so forth. It's also very important to include rebound effects, so these sort of micro level things need to be checked at the macro level, and you'll notice in one of, I think on the slide that Kevin had when he was talking about transport, he had a little statement up the top that said, assuming no rebound effects. And if you drive your car 70% less and you have, as a result, 20,000 Swedish krona at the end of the year, there's a lot of literature which shows that you just go fly to Thailand. And we really need to consider these rebound effects if you want to have an efficient policy. Is anyone listening? Is anything happening? Things are starting to happen. When we had our paper published last year, there was a lot of coverage and a good response. Since then, there's been many things that have happened. I'm not saying because of our study, but because of many studies coming along the same lines. The Nordic Council of Ministers had a report come out on the Nordic carbon footprints. The European Commission just released a tender on policy instruments for consumption-based emissions. The framework, the FP7 funding program in the EU just has a call out on policy instruments for consumption. The UK just had a select committee, parliamentary select committee on consumption-based emissions. So there's some politicians talking about these things, interested in these things. So things are starting to move, and I think there's going to be lots of interesting things happening in the future. And I'll leave it there. Oh, actually, just my conclusions. Of course, you need to give me more money so I can do more analysis, etc., etc., etc. That's almost given in anyone's presentation. But in truth, the real weakness is there's basically been no research on policy instruments that work for consumption-based emissions, virtually nothing. It's very much a production focus on policy instruments. And something that came up, sort of was mentioned as the last question, political feasibility. And we can always have these magnificent ideas. What matters is what's feasible. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Glen. Thank you. So back to the political feasibility as opposed to what science is really calling for is interesting. Are there any pressing questions? Otherwise, Glen will be back in the panel. And I suggest, are there questions for clarification? Then I suggest actually that we take a break and have our call.